I learned how to fight there. I learned how to snort meth there. I learned how miserable life can be.
Hello, my name is Pej. I'm an interventionist. I help a lot of people with addiction, alcoholism, and mental health. Today we're with my friend Mason. We are going to talk extensively about a lot of different things, but we'll do a few different videos. But to start off with, I want to talk to Mason about his youth, about when he was an adolescent. Mason, welcome.
Thank you.
So I want to
Appreciate it.
ask you, when did you first start using drugs? How old were you?
I was 14. My mother was extremely abusive, and at the time she would tell me these horror stories about the foster care system, and also say like I'd never be allowed to live with my dad because he was a piece of shit drunk. And I felt trapped. I didn't think I could. One of us would have killed each other if I had to stay until 18. So I didn't want to be a murderer or get killed. Well, so I decided to go out on the cliffs of Sunken City and San Pedro where people kill themselves, and take my first drink and my first drug, some of my mom's Xanax. She was a benzo addict.
Was it hard alcohol or was it beers?
It was
Absolute?
Absolute.
That's what I think you told me before.
Yep.
So you did Absolute, you took Xanax, and what happened?
Sitting on the cliffs of Sunken City.
You obviously didn't succeed with the wanting to kill yourself part.
Unless this is another parallel life.
A whole different Mason.
A whole different, yeah. But no, I sat there. At first, when I hadn't used, I was ready. I just was going to wait and look at the ocean. It was beautiful. When you think you're going to die, everything becomes so beautiful. The ocean, just the sound of the tide coming in and out, and just the absolute blackness, the void of the ocean at night with no lights. That's where I thought I was going. And then I took a swig, popped a few bars. No, took one bar at first. I took them a little incrementally. And I felt better. I felt like happier, number. So I wanted more time, as much time as possible, sitting on those cliffs before I ended it. And by the time I was going to do it, before that, I had passed out from taking 3 bars and drinking about half. No, I would say it's more like, it was like a third of a bottle of Absolute.
So after not succeeding with your suicide and actually loving the effect that came out of doing that, throughout your adolescence, what did you start to get into afterwards?
So pretty shortly after that experience, my mom bit my arm off, or my elbow off. I'm sorry, I have an arm too, actually. But I just realized, and she was getting sexually abusive, I couldn't take it, so I packed up a bag and just walked 6 hours to my grandma's house where my dad was, who I hadn't seen in 7 years, either of them.
Did you emancipate during that time?
I was emancipated after, and went to live with him. He was drunk, when I got there, and my grandma now had mid-stage Alzheimer's dementia, and so then I was trying to take care of my dad and taking bottles from him because he had a cirrhotic liver and was drinking on it. And the first real influence experience I ever had was drinking his Jägermeister. And I remember going on top of my grandma's hill feeling this happiness, this absolute peace with the world, and so happy, more happy than I'd ever been in my life. And I said to myself, and I still remember, which is impressive for my brain to remember, that I never wanted to not feel like this again. I wanted to recreate this as often as humanly possible, and I tried very hard to do that.
Do you think some of the trauma that you encountered from your mother's side, and then on top of that having a father that was obviously if he had cirrhosis of the liver and he was drinking, there's possible alcoholism, right? So do you think that you had taken on their trauma, and hence the reason you wanted to not live when you were 14, but then get into other stuff like this was hereditary, it was kind of genetic?
Yeah, so I had a lot of, I now view them more as excuses, but at the time I was a child, so it was, there's less liability there. With the first attempt at suicide, it was just because I had been told the foster care system, you'll get raped, neglected, all this stuff. So that went out of an option in my mind. That wasn't an option. And the only option she had told me, because my dad was an alcoholic, was that I had to live with her until 18. And it was not so much about wanting to die. It was more of I'd rather die than do that, because one of us would die by the 18th.
So throughout your adolescent period, did you start getting into other things like hallucinogens and things like that?
Yes. My dad, shortly after I was emancipated and lived with him, he was transferred to a convalescent care because his liver was so bad. And so I was just living alone. I dropped out of school because I didn't have a ride to high school, and I had no money, but I had friends who did drugs, and they offered to front me a really generous portion of, it was like a little buffet of substances. It was some Roxy's, some bars, like 25 of each, I think, like 20 grams of mushrooms, a sheet of acid, and I experimented with all those and barely sold enough to maintain being a little drug dealer, which I really was. I was terrible at dealing drugs. I just used them.
Did you have any idea where they were obtaining this stuff from?
A supplier out of Long Beach, but it was because
it wasn't like the dark web or anything. It was from an actual plug, if you will.
Plug, yeah. Because I lived right under Palos Verdes, and they saw me as someone who could sell to the rich kids. I'm from San Pedro, and it was like a perfect setup. Long Beach goes through us minors who will take the fall for possession, but they will also take the money from us for dealing to like people in our high school and that we knew.
And then by the time you were in the later part of your adolescence, had you ever encountered any kind of treatment or help?
So I think something that really set me back was the first time I ever went to any sort of like help type thing, entity. I was living from couch to couch in a truck or camping out somewhere for months, and then my girlfriend's family invited me to live with them. So all of a sudden I was living in this mansion with these beautiful people who had no problems, but had way crazier problems than I could have ever imagined. And after, the mom really tried to love me like a mom, but I didn't know how to be loved from a mom, so it freaked me out, and I started using more and more frequently and stopped being able to hold my construction work job. And so she gave me like at least 30 chances, and I fucked them all up and was homeless again at 17 and a half. So I went to my union rep, who like takes care of like insurance stuff and help resources, and I said, hey, I'm homeless, pretty sure I'm an addict. If you could help me get somewhere that would help me with that, yeah, I appreciate it, because I'm a homeless minor right now. This woman chooses to send me to a Mormon-run behavior modification labor camp in Brigham City, Utah, North Utah, 2000.
How old were you then?
I was 17.
17,
all Mormon town. We shoveled snow, we baled hay. There was only like 2 other kids.
Was it like a wilderness program?
It was like a hybrid between, we were either holed up in a very locked down center because the majority of the kids weren't insurance. They didn't get bamboozled like me and a couple other friends. They were juvenile delinquents who were there because juvie was overrun, and they did that to serve their time. And so it was more traumatizing than a lot of other experiences I've had in my life. It was, you sign over your rights in Utah. The legislature is very unique, where they can hold you to 25. So I turned 18 there. I learned how to fight there. I learned how to snort meth there. I learned how miserable life can be. Sleeping in a 4-man bunk. It was like beyond tiny. It was overcrowded in the center, and then we were out doing things. We were on lock and chain or lock and key. So that was when I got out of that after 9 months. Supposed to be a month. And they had used up as much of my insurance as they could. They sent me back home to Long Beach with a laminated like ID that wasn't an ID and no money, and they hadn't contacted anyone. That my dad was in convalescent care and my mom wasn't an option, so I don't know who they could have contacted. But I just landed at the airport with no money, nowhere to go, and a phone that didn't work, and some clothes. And so I just hailed a taxi cab to my grandma's house and hopped out of the car like 2 blocks before we got there.
Okay, so that's the first part of this video. We are going to continue and talk more about Mason's story as we get into the other videos.